Good morning here in the United States and good afternoon to those of you in Europe, and welcome to the third installment of Face Off, the new GMF live snap debate featuring one question, two opinions, and 30 minutes. I'm Ariane Tabatabai, the Middle East Fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy here at the German Marshall Fund. And today we will be answering the following question. Is the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign on Iran working? In May 2018, President Trump announced that he was withdrawing the United States from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, the nuclear deal concluded in 2015. The deal was negotiated by the United States, its European allies, Germany, the UK, France, and the EU, as well as Russia and China. And it was limited in scope. It aimed to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, and it sought to limit Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for some sanctions relief. Since the Trump administration's policy of maximum pressure on Iran has become a source of controversy here in the US, in Europe, and around the world. As the administration sees it, the maximum pressure campaign is designed to lead to change in Iranian behavior, including on its nuclear, missile, regional, and terrorism-related activities. The main tools used by the administration are political pressure and economic sanctions. So today, we will dive into this question. Is the maximum pressure campaign on Iran working? Our debate today will feature a twist. Our speakers will be switching positions with which they strongly disagree. We thought that would be an interesting and helpful intellectual exercise. The two sides may agree on the broad objectives of US policy toward Iran, but when it comes to their actual implementation, they don't really see eye to eye. So we'll be asking our speakers today whether the maximum pressure campaign is working, and Mark Dubowitz will say no. In real life, he is a prominent supporter of the maximum pressure campaign. Mark is the chief executive of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, FDD. He has advised multiple administrations on Iran policy in general and sanctions in particular. He has testified a number of times before the US Congress. And for his work, he has been sanctioned by the Iranian regime, and so has his organization, FDD. And yes, will argue Richard Nephew, the maximum pressure campaign is working. Richard's actual position would be, no, it's not. Richard is a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. He is the author of the book, The Art of Sanctions, which he wrote after leaving the US government in 2015, where he held a number of positions, including as the lead sanctions expert for the US team negotiating with Iran. Thank you both for joining us today and for switching things up a little bit and arguing for policies you have worked on and advocated for a number of years. Now, before we get started, I'm going to launch our poll, and our audience will be taking the poll, will be answering the question, is the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign working? The poll is going live now for 30 seconds. And while you're voting and while you're watching the debate, also make sure to tweet at hashtag GMF FaceOff. We will be monitoring your comments on Twitter, and we will take the poll again at the end of the discussion to see which one of our two speakers managed to sway you in their opposite direction, actually. So we have 3 seconds left, and here we are. So our audience says 23% say yes, the maximum pressure campaign is working, and 77% say no, it is not. We'll do this again at the end of the debate. All right, so let's get started. You each get 5 minutes to make your opening case, and I will actually switch things up a little bit as well and start with the no presented by Mark. The maximum pressure campaign is not working, will argue Mark Dubowitz. Mark, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank GMF for the kind invitation. And a special thank you to you, Ariane, for recommending this very interesting format, and to Rich for his superb essay defending his decision to join this debate. I think if Rich debates as persuasively as he writes, I'm in a lot of trouble. So I was asked to argue against this proposition that the maximum pressure on Iran is working. And this is not my normal position because I believe emphatically that it is, but here it goes. So the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign against the Islamic Republic could be considered a passable success were it not for the president's primary goal, a new comprehensive, more verifiable agreement that does not financially aid the regime's imperialism. That was mission impossible, since the Supreme Leader's explicit premise for undertaking the JCPOA was short-term nuclear restraint for large and upfront economic rewards. Now, Trump was never willing to put the pedal to the metal, maximum pressure using all instruments of American power. We have seen, however, a unilateral economic warfare campaign that, aided by the sclerosis of Iran's corrupt state-controlled economy, has devastated the Islamic Republic, but it has not achieved the explicit objective for which it was designed, and that is to force Iran back to the table to negotiate a comprehensive agreement that meets all of the administration's 12 parameters. And the maximum pressure campaign also has not achieved its perhaps unstated objective, which is to destabilize the regime so severely that it will collapse and be replaced by a more responsible and pro-American government. The people of Iran have taken to the streets repeatedly to get rid of the regime, but there's no serious American action plan to support their aspirations for democracy. Under Trump, American diplomatic power has been degraded as the president has picked fights with allies across a range of issues. Instead of building consensus on non-Iranian concerns so that he could deploy political leverage against Tehran as the priority, Trump often became venomous towards those, especially in Europe, who have no love for the Islamic Republic. Since the 1980s, Rouhani has been a broken record about exploiting transatlantic rifts, and Trump certainly has abetted his designs. Under Trump, American cyber power has been mostly reactive and insufficient to deter increasing Iranian cyber attacks. American covert action has been insufficient to set back Iran's nuclear and missile programs or threaten the regime's stability. American political warfare has been contradictory between support for Iranian human rights and a desire for a new deal with Tehran. And in fact, the 12 parameters don't include anything on human rights. And Trump's travel ban on all Iranians has played to the mullah's political advantage. Most critically, the use of American might under Trump has been fickle. The killing of Soleimani certainly shocked Tehran, but before that, Iran struck multiple blows against Saudi Arabian energy, American drones, international shipping without any US reprisal. And since then, Iranian-backed militias have regularly targeted Americans without any US military response. And Trump still threatens to remove most US forces from Syria and signals a willingness to do the same thing in Iraq and Afghanistan. Militarily, Trump has outsourced a limited version of maximum pressure to Israel, a country without America's power projection capabilities. Through a relentless use of intelligence and air power, Jerusalem certainly has downgraded Iranian ambitions throughout Syria, and certainly more good news with the normalization between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain, and even Saudi Arabia, perhaps in the near future. But as we saw, after the Iranian attack on the Saudi oil facility, the Gulf Arabs tend to be timid, and when they do act militarily, ineffectual. So with increased American unpredictability and self-doubt, Jerusalem stands increasingly alone against the clerical regime's ambitions. Sensing weakness, Tehran is escalating. The regime has enriched greater levels of LEU to accumulate enough fissile material for 1, possibly 2 nuclear weapons, installed advanced centrifuges to enable an easier clandestine sneak out, and driven breakout time from 1 year to a few months. Even the Trump administration's successful economic warfare campaign has failed to target the hundreds of billions of dollars of offshore assets and off-the-book assets that the regime uses to keep its system functioning. The administration is not targeting the foreign branch offices of designated Iranian banks that are still financing billions of dollars of trade, nor is it doing enough to crack down on regional trade networks. And without a political destabilization strategy to complement economic pressure, Iranian protesters have been left alone to face the brutal repression of the regime's security services. In relying only on the economic pressure to achieve a better deal than the JCPOA, Trump inevitably crippled American power. American focus, forbearance, and a willingness to intervene and push back are essential ingredients for success against the Islamic Republic, as they were against the Soviet Union. These are not Trumpian virtues, and at the moment, they may not even be the virtues of either American political party. However, the ruling elite in Iran seems to have the focus, forbearance, and willingness to secure their regime and maintain patient pathways to nuclear weapons. I'll just finish with this. Trump's maximum pressure on Iran is not working. The time to make it work may have run out.
Thank you, Mark. Richard, over to you to argue that, yes, the maximum pressure campaign on Iran is working. And as a reminder to our audience, your actual position would be the opposite. Here, over to you.
Great, thanks very much. And thanks both to you, GMF, and to Mark for hosting this debate. I have to say at the outset, this has taken a slightly different angle than I think may have been envisioned at the beginning, but it's okay because that's actually a contingency I thought through a little bit as well. And I think that it still offers us a really good opportunity to think through the implications of the strategy that's been taken. So, the task before me is to argue that maximum pressure has been a success vis-a-vis Iran. And I think we first need to define what we mean by success. In most sanctions contexts, success is defined by have we achieved the outcome set up for sanctions, which the Trump administration has defined variously as a combination of regime change and policy change elements. I actually don't think anyone would argue that these things have happened just as a sheer matter of fact. So the real question is, are we seeing the building blocks of a effort that could potentially be effective in either achieving regime change or policy change? Or is the sanctions approach proceeding in such a way as it might be able to change Iran's calculus? I think the argument in favor of that proposition is fairly straightforward. It has in the past, and with sufficient energy, such a strategy could do so again. If you look at the sanctions effort that has been put to Iran, the Trump administration has certainly applied with vigor the pre-JCPOA sanctions that they put back in place and added to it a few sectors of import to the Iranian economy. All the major macroeconomic indicators in the country are pointing down. Unemployment remains high, inflation is high, the currency has been substantially devalued, oil sales have cratered, and in the current global market, there's minimal prospects for revival just on the basis of the desirability of barrels. More significantly, there are substantial indications that the Iranian leadership has run out of non-sanctions relief ways of solving these problems. They've tried import substitution to reduce their need for our currency, but they found the domestic industrial sector is just not up to the task thus far. And there have been some improvements, but still, I don't think it's made up for lost imports. They've tried incentivizing the wealthy to reinvest in Iran through a variety of schemes, including selling oil in the stock market and via brokerage. And these efforts have mainly fallen on deaf ears. And instead, we actually see indications that wealthy Iranians are investing in property across the border. In Turkey, hardly a sign of support for the Iranian government. They've engaged in more traditional sanctions busting, trying to export oil covertly, among other things. We haven't really seen indication that that's been wildly successful either. And again, Iran's economy is diversifying, but it's still primarily a hydrocarbon dependent economy. And they tried to diversify into other areas, as I said, which sanctions have occasionally hit, but where they've run into more general problems, frankly, of market share, questions as to quality products, and similar. And so I think overall, the inability of Iran to overturn the impact of sanctions suggests that the pressure is probably building on the system. They've been able to weather it for the last 2 years, but that's not actually a new phenomenon. They also did that in 2011 to 2013, but by 2013, they were prepared to come to the negotiating table. And so the question really is, what do we do with the current situation to make the maximum sanctions, maximum pressure campaign successful? I think, frankly, what we can do is we can look to the president's own statements in this regard that Mark has called into question here. The president has said that he would like to have a better deal. He said that he would like to try and improve upon the JCPOA. And even if we may have our various different views on whether or not he ought to be the president and ought to be the president in a few months, the president, he still is for the time being. And therefore, it's his goals, it's his strategy that actually do need to drive U.S. foreign policy, and certainly with respect to the executive branch, even if other parts of the administration feel differently and want instead regime change and so forth. So the real question now is, how do we utilize pressure to turn what they've been able to generate into a renewed diplomatic effort? And I think that there are lots of indications that the Iranians will be potentially prepared to negotiate with the Trump administration if he is in fact reelected, or certainly with a Biden administration if that's the outcome of the election. The other interesting thing that I would just note here, too, has been that the maximum pressure campaign has put doubts as to the power of U.S. sanctioned snapback firmly aside. And it's worth noting that in the context of any future negotiation. Of course, one of the stated points of opposition to the JCPOA back in 2015 is that we'd never be able to reconstitute the pressure that we had then. But of course, we've been able to demonstrate that that is in fact definitively not the case. As a consequence, some of the risks that we're seeing in terms of going back into a deal actually have been put to a lie. We've been able to find that engaging in negotiations, coming up with a deal is a viable strategy, one that can be managed with U.S. sanctions back, and that the Iranians themselves have demonstrated willingness to observe, even despite the fact that the U.S. withdrew from the agreement. Thank you.
All right, thank you both for your interesting points here. Richard, I'm going to switch around and have you actually go first and ask you a couple of questions. So let me pick up on the point that Mark made about the administration failing to build consensus on Iran policy. Since at GMF, one of our primary concerns is the transatlantic relationship, I want to sort of turn that question to you and ask you whether the sort of isolation that the Trump administration has created over Iran has affected its ability to, I guess, to build a more effective Iran policy with the maximum pressure campaign.
Yeah, and again, in keeping with the spirit of the exercise, let me say that I think that there certainly has been limitations that have been established on the policy, but if we are looking at just simple macroeconomic factors, we've certainly seen that the Trump administration's been able to use the sanctions that were developed prior to coming into office to great effect and to work notwithstanding European objections. I think an interesting question has to be, kind of put out there, but maybe set aside for the moment, is the degree to which Europe's lack of cohesion is actually, as much of anything, a reason why they were unable to mount a solid defense of their own policy views here. But I think in terms of where maximum pressure leaves us, look, I think that there are much broader transatlantic concerns with the Trump administration. I think that those go to trade policy, they go to Russia policy, a whole range of things. I think that if, in fact, the president were to try and realize what is his vision for his Iran policy and pursuing a better deal, I actually think that he would find that he has a lot of support with governments in Europe. And in fact, the 2018 experience demonstrates that when the administration was prepared to work with Europe, they had people there who were prepared to work with U.S. interests as well. So I think there are ways in which the transatlantic relationship can be managed, notwithstanding the damage that may have been done to it.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to actually pose the same question to you, but switch it around a little bit. So, there is this argument that the United States doesn't need an international consensus to make its Iran policy effective, right? And that the Trump administration experiment actually shows that. What do you say to those who argue that?
Right. Again, in the spirit of the switcheroo, I first want to make it clear. I mean, Rich is arguing that the maximum pressure campaign could work, might work foreseeably in the future, has a chance of working. The actual explicit proposition is it working today? And I would argue it's not working today. And one of the major reasons it's not working today is because I think the United States has isolated itself, and in doing so has really given Hassan Rouhani a dream scenario, which he's been working for decades, as Ali Khamenei, which he's moved Iran from political isolation to having Europe and Asia supporting Tehran, whereas the Trump administration is now badly politically isolated. Rich is right. You don't need multilateral support for economic warfare, as the Trump administration has demonstrated. You do need multilateral support for political warfare and for effective diplomacy. And I think there, the Trump administration and President Trump himself versus the administration has badly mishandled the diplomacy, because he's gone to war against Angela Merkel and the Brits and the French. And in doing so, he's really undercut our allies and undercut the multilateral support that we could otherwise have leveraged against Tehran.
Thanks, Mark. All right, so let me turn to another question. Richard, I'll again start with you. So, sort of picking up on something that you both brought up, how do you respond to those who would say that economic impact does not translate into sort of a change in behavior in all the areas that the Trump administration itself and the 12 points that you've mentioned has tried to kind of bring about a change in behavior?
Thanks. I mean, so again, in the context of the exercise, is it working as opposed to has it worked? The question really is, what's the final end goal here, right? And this is one where it's worth kind of, setting out there the fact that we've had both policy change as a goal as well as regime change as a goal. We've had 12 points, we've had 13 points, we've had 14 points. So I think, look, the simple reality is that in anybody's construct of how sanctions pressure is going to work, I don't think that anyone thought that we would impose pressure and we achieve success on all those grounds immediately. And some of them are going to require negotiations. Some of them are going to require unilateral steps on the part of the Iranians and so forth. In terms of taking the position that I've got, I think the argument would be, is working to create the pressure required to make change. But this is where what the Iranian strategy has to come into effect, right? The fact of the matter is the Iranians have decided to see if they can wait out the Trump administration, to see whether or not they at least get through this first term and there's a change in how Trump himself is managing his government. And then if not that, to see whether or not Joe Biden's elected president and they get fundamental changes there too. So the real test for whether or not it has worked is going to happen after we've seen the Iranian current strategy and effort fail or succeed in whether or not they can wait things out. I will say that I think that some of the power of the sanctions campaign has been about limiting resources. That's an argument that I do think has some merit. Certainly, we've seen that there have been budget cuts in terms of support being given to Hezbollah and to other groups. We've got reports about militant groups not getting the support that they wanted. Presumably, the missile program, the nuclear program, other programs are not getting nearly the share of resources that they would be able to get, or at a minimum, are finding it difficult to engage in procurement. So I think all of those things are part and parcel of a maximum pressure campaign that is doing damage. It is limiting some of the options that the Iranians have.
Mark, let me pose that question to you as well. So, yes, one of the sort of arguments for the maximum pressure campaign has been that it is denying Iran the financial means to pursue some of its more troubling activities. The administration often points to this as one of the big sort of metrics for the success of the maximum pressure campaign. What's your response to that? How do you respond to those who argue that the maximum pressure campaign is denying Iran the financial means, for example, to support its proxies outside of its territory, or that it doesn't have as much money to pour into its missile program, for example?
I think rolling back regime imperialism in the region requires more than economic warfare. It requires more than denying the regime resources, because at the end of the day, the regime, in that classic guns versus butter trade-off, right, guns for terrorists or butter for its people, this regime is going to choose guns for terrorists and support for Assad's genocide in Syria over the well-being of Iranians. And that's exactly what they've done. I mean, the proxies may be struggling because of a reduced transfer payments to them from Iran, but the IRGC is just doing great, double-digit increases in their latest budget. And so obviously Khamenei has made the decision that he's going to keep the IRGC well-fed, well-supplied for both brutal internal repression and external aggression. So a maximum pressure campaign that depends only on denying resources is not going to be effective in rolling back Iranian regional ambitions. That's why all instruments of American power needed to be brought to bear, and President Trump showed up with only the economic one.
Mark, let me pick up on this and pose a follow-up, and this will be my final question. And then, Richard, I'll give you an opportunity to also answer this question. So, one of the big criticisms of the approach that you're advocating for here, right, and the maximum pressure campaign as well, has been that it has had a significant humanitarian cost. How do you respond to those who would say that what you're describing here would lead to more suffering, not just by the regime, but by 80-some million Iranians as well?
Well, again, I think the maximum pressure campaign against Iran is not working. And that's the position I'm adopting for this exercise. And I think, one of the reasons it's not working is because this regime has proven time and time again that the hundreds of billions of dollars that it has in off-the-book assets, it's going to spend on the IRGC, on internal repression, and on regional aggression. It's not going to transfer that money to the Iranian Health Ministry to spend on humanitarian goods, even though it has more than sufficient assets to do so, and it has the channels to procure humanitarian goods from abroad. So this is the problem with this regime, and this is the problem with a strategy that depends only on economic deprivation and doesn't use other instruments of American power, diplomatic, cyber, covert action, and a credible threat of military force in order to make it clear to this regime that they have a fundamental choice between a change in behavior or their survival, but they can't have both.
Thanks, Richard. Do you have anything you want to add on this note?
Sure. I mean, again, you know, the position that I'll take here, but I think is also reflected in the position that's been taken by the president, is that we're trying to get a better deal here, and a better deal does not presuppose that you need to impose sweeping humanitarian catastrophe on the Iranian population, and so that's part of the reason why the administration has sought to have at least some amount of humanitarian trade that would go forward. To try and have humanitarian channels for financing, while you've seen a willingness to allow the South Koreans, for instance, to be able to let the Iranians have access to the resources there in order to buy goods. You've seen similar out of Iraq. And I think that all speaks to the question of, is it necessary to cause a humanitarian catastrophe in order to have the kind of sanctions pressure that's required to achieve the president's goal, which is a better deal? And I think the answer to that is no. I think it's also worth keeping, of course, in mind the fact that in any circumstance, I would argue that there are strong incentives that are present for the U.S. itself to be seen as not a sadistic actor. And so from that standpoint, presupposing that you need to have some amount of humanitarian damage as part of a successful sanctions campaign, and then suggesting that you need lots of it to have a successful sanctions campaign, I don't think are consistent. I think the idea is that you want to try and show that there is reasonableness and seriousness and sobriety behind the strategy and not just simply sadism.
Thanks, Richard. Thank you both for agreeing to do this and for your arguments. As a reminder to our audience, I will be launching the poll again. And the question, in case you forgot it, in the past 30 minutes is the maximum pressure campaign on Iran working? So you have 25 seconds to answer the question now. And I just want to remind our audience as well that the next installment of the GMF Face-Off debate will be in November, and my colleagues will be discussing the U.S.-Turkish relationship. You have now 3 seconds to answer the question, and we're now ending the poll. All right, so is the maximum pressure campaign on Iran working? 21% of our audience say yes, 79% say no. Again, thank you so much to you, Richard and Mark, for agreeing to do this today and switching sides. And we look forward to seeing you in November. Thanks also to my GMF colleagues for organizing this and for all of you tuning in today and watching the debate. Thank you, and in this note, have a good rest of your day in the US and a great evening in Europe.